Okay, so happy Halloween and happy Diwali and to those who celebrate. So foraging, but the other important thing is this group project stuff that we've got due next week, which we talked a lot about last time, but happy to take questions on that. Still, now that I've gotten F units done and I've designed G, I'll have these, and again, I'll probably set the due dates as if they on the normal schedule, but I'm going to give you at least a week for those. And if I go too long, then I'll make some other adjustments, like add another drop or something like that. So don't worry that these aren't available yet. I'm getting there. It's just had two defenses from my students this week, and it just got a little stretched thin, so I didn't get quite enough time between editing dissertations and things to do that. But but it'll be there, and I'll give you plenty of time. And if I don't, then I'll give you some other concession to make sure that that credit doesn't hurt. Otherwise, any questions about the group project stuff? All right. So last time we talked about patches and patch leaving rules, or not necessarily patch leaving rules. We didn't focus too much on the mechanisms, but patch residence times, the optimal times to leave a patch. I just want to check something before I go too far here. Okay. So then the idea behind our patch residence rules here is that we've got this forager that is moving around areas that have relatively little to forage on or little to search for, and then hits an area where they have to do a lot of search. And the question is, do you spend a lot of time searching there or a little time searching there? And how does the environment affect that behavior? So what we talked about is the way this is typically modeled is you form this sort of instantaneous gain uh, characterization of each patch type. And so this is saying for flowers of this type, inflorescences, whatever it may be, then the you spend a certain amount of time in there, and then on average, you get a certain gain out. So as you enter in early, you eat all it's very easy to find stuff, but as you stay late, you end up depleting the whole thing. And so as it gets depleted, there's nothing else to find. So there is sort of a maximum here. Ideally, there's some point in the middle where you leave early enough because it's better for you to be searching for a new fresh patch than it is for you to continue to exploit this patch. So that's kind of the idea there. And so we introduced the marginal value theorem as a way to predict how animals might respond to the differences across patches and also in search time between patches. And so the idea there was sort of this diagram, which I hope you kind of commit to memory. If for a simple single patch environment, single patch type environment, where the only patches are of this type, then you would plot the instantaneous gain in one patch on the kind of right side of the axis. And then you'd plot the average search time between patches as a dot on the left side, kind of going in the other direction. And then you just anchor a line at that point and let it swing down until it hits a point of tangency on that curve. And that point of tangency that supports it will be the predicted time that the optimal forager will stay in that patch. And the nice thing about that model is that as you can see it, as you shift, if you make patches closer together, it's sort of easy to see that the line that this point will swing in and will end up spending less time in every patch because they're closer together. So you can very quickly get to a new patch. But if you spread the patches out so there's more time in between them, then you're going to spend more time in each patch because now it's more costly to search. So you're not losing out as much on the search because if you leave early, you're going to be spending most of your time searching without getting any gains anyway. So you may as well stay in the current patch a little longer. It's kind of the idea here. So the general prediction is that poor, sparser environments, that's going that way on the axis, going to the left, lead to longer residence times. And this is described mathematically down here as the instantaneous rate of gain in the patch. That's something we also call the marginal gain. Marginal is just a fancy word for sort of over a small time unit. So the amount of gain you get for the next time unit of investment, that marginal you leave when that marginal gain drops to the long-term rate of the environment. So how much it's almost like the marginal returns from searching is kind of what's on the right-hand side here. So this is the marginal returns from exploiting the patch. This is the marginal returns from going elsewhere and finding other patches. And you kind of balance the two of them out. You match the two together. That's where this optimal time is here. So another way to interpret this on the right-hand side is a so-called opportunity cost. So this is the sort of the price, if you want to call it that, if you consider the time in the denominator as what you're paying and the numerator is the calories that you're getting. This is like calories per dollar, calories per time. If time is money, then that's the opportunity cost. That's how much you're losing out for every unit of time you're spending in here. So if this has a bigger return than what you're losing out on, you stay here. But at the instant when the rate that you're getting out of the patch drops to this point or lower, then you say it's a better use of my time to take my next unit of time and put it into search. I'll get more out of that. That's the marginal value theorem. So, any questions about this depiction? What it's communicating there? Okay. So, if we think more generally, so what if you have more than one patch type? Then what you end up getting, if you think about it all through, is every single patch is going to have that marginal value theorem, that formula that was on the previous slide down here. That means that every single patch is, since they're all equal to the same thing, they're all going to be equal to each other. So every patch's instantaneous rate of gain is going to be equalized. And so this is how that would be depicted as the derivative with respect to the handling time of every patch. So the instantaneous rate of gain, the marginal gain in every patch at each of their handling times or each of their residence times ends up being the same. The residence times aren't the same. This could be a really rich patch that you stay in for a long time. This could be a poor patch you leave almost immediately, and so on and so forth. But this is saying that whatever residence time for that patch type, they will balance out so that the instantaneous rate of gain is going to be the same across the patch types. And that is also going to be the same as the long-term rate of gain you just get from searching in general. So that is another depiction of the marginal value theorem, is that across patches you see this equalization. And in economics, they have a name for this called the equimarginal principle. So this is if you take an economics course, a microeconomics course, and you talk about like consumer choice theory, then there's the idea of if you've got so many dollars to spend, where do you put that money into? And the idea is you get a certain amount of utility, like, well, I get a certain amount of utility from a streaming service. I get a certain amount of utility from a gaming service, a certain amount of utility from buying a particular food that I like every week, and so on and so forth. And if you're on a budget, you can't do all of those things. You have to choose how to balance those. And what the economists think that the optimal person who maximizes their happiness is they will, subject to their money constraint, which is like the forager's time constraint, they will balance the returns. So something that's cheap, you might buy more of. Something that's more expensive, you might buy less of. But you're going to equalize your investments across your options so that the marginal returns from each will be equal to each other. And that's exactly what is being predicted by this foraging model. The people in biology typically don't call it an equimarginal principle, but it's mathematically identical. And you could tell that in the 80s when they were coming up with it, they had the same ideas in mind. They just weren't reading the same literature. So this is one of these kind of cool examples where two disciplines, economics and optimal foraging, kind of come up with roughly the same thing without talking to each other. So it's like a convergent evolution on an explanation for behavior, which I think is kind of neat. But anyways, in both of those cases, we can ask, what are the predictions here? Well, I mentioned the predictions in a poorer or sparser environment, you get a longer time in all patches. And then, so that's across environments. So if I take an environment and I make it sparser, then I would expect the animal in all of the patches to stay longer in them. But then within an environment, across patches, the prediction would be that if I have a patch that's relatively richer, its marginal returns don't deplete as quickly. Then, relative to other patches within that environment that aren't as rich, it should spend a longer time in there. Those are our kind of two predictions. And so, the interesting thing is that we can also flip that around. So sometimes we would like to know, is this a rich environment? And it might be very difficult for us as ecologists to go out and measure how rich the environment is. But we can look at the behavior of different animals and then make inferences about the what might be in common among those animals. And so, if a bunch of students email me and they ask me all for the same concession on the same day, like, hey, this thing's happening, or whatever. I mean, regardless of whether they provide an explanation or all that, if I just notice, like, wow, that's weird, like 30 students all asked for exactly the same thing on the same day, then there must be something going on that day. There must be, a concert or something on campus or some other, that would be me, using the behavior of the students to make an inference about the environment. And we can do the same thing with the animals. We can look across them and say, well, we're noticing that this animal is spending a very long time in a particular patch, and a surprisingly long time. Why aren't they leaving? Well, they may not be leaving because it turns out that the rest of the habitat just doesn't have anything in it. And so their estimate, they are so hungry that so they have an estimate of a low rate of return from the environment. And so those mechanisms that have been selected along these pressures keep them in that for longer. Likewise, if we notice an animal it hardly spends any time in any patch and then moves on, then we can make an inference that must be a pretty rich environment. There must be a lot of patch opportunities out there. Otherwise, this animal that we see lingering in other habitats, in this one, seems to be moving very quickly. So you can use behavior as sort of a thermostat to try to understand things that are really hard to measure about the environment, which I think is pretty cool. And that's something that we'll actually see again in what the new thing we're going to talk about today, that this sort of has hints of G by E, and that the behavior of the animal is not just what the animal intrinsically likes, but the animal spends more time or eats different things based on properties of the environment. So it's nice to be able to predict, based on what's going on in the environment, how that'll change the animal's behavior. But we can also go in the reverse case, is that if we study animal behaviors, because we know behaviors are a phenotype, which in part is set up by environment, then being able to assess changes in behavior allow us to also assess changes in environment. And again, we'll see a little bit of that again today. All right, so questions. That was a summary of the marginal value theorem will show up in a sort today as well, which is why I wanted to review that. So does everybody feel comfortable about the marginal value theorem, the MVT? Okay. All right, so slightly different problem then. So I used this video at the beginning of foraging to motivate a number of different things. So originally, when I was looking at this, I was talking about the speed choice. Well, now, I watch these quail, and they're going around, and there are opportunities for them to eat something that they pass up. So that's kind of the question here is, which prey items are being eaten, which ones are being ignored, and why? That is the fundamental question of diet choice. So how do we, what is the optimal prey choice? So assuming that animals forage in an efficient way that reduces the opportunity cost of foraging, maximizes the rate of gain, then we would expect that to have downstream effects on their prey choice that we can test for. And that's so then what are those predictions? How do we get that? So this is the basic so-called prey model. And so the idea here is I have a bunch of these patches that are scattered throughout this environment. And so I've just numbered them by type in this case. So I've got a type 1 patch that on average, see, these are lumped prey items. These are not patches anymore. So when I enter this, if I decide to eat this disc, then I get all of the gain, but I have to pay all of the handling time. So that's the key difference between the prey model and the patch model, is it's everything's lumped where it's all or nothing. So you either ignore this and don't pay any of the handling time, but you do get some of the gain, or you decide to eat this and then you pay all of the handling time, but then you get all of the calories out of it. So we've got our quail, for example, and it then wanders through here in a random way, and we notice that as it encounters things that we've seen it eat in other habits, so we know it can perceive them. Some of them it eats, thumbs up. Some of them it doesn't, thumbs down, and so on and so forth. And so then the question is, how do we make sense of what's getting eaten and what's not getting eaten? That's the beginning of the prey model here. That's the problem we aim to try to solve. So Holling's disk equation, that's our fitness proxy that we've been using in this optimal foraging theory so far. And so I've generalized Holling's disk equation for multiple prey types here. So before we had talked about it for one type of disk or one type of patch. Now we got it for multiple types, but it's not gonna matter that much. It's more that it exists is what kind of matters to us. And so I said it's this ratio of capital G to capital S plus H, where capital G, instead of being the gain from one prey type, I'm saying it's the average gain from all prey that I eat in my diet. So if I eat a bunch of type 1 and a little bit of type 2, then it will be that average gain will be closer to the type 1 gain than the type 2 gain. If I eat an equal amount of type 1 and type 2, then this average gain will be the average of whatever type 1's gain is and type 2's gain. So it's just if you were to add up everything the animal eats and take the average of all the calories that it got across all of those, then that's the numerator here. Likewise, in the denominator, H is the average handling time. So if you added up all the time it took an animal to handle all of the prey that it chose to eat, and you take that average, that's what this capital H is. And then this capital S is if you took all of the time in between, so all of the search time in between finding prey, added all those up, took the average, then that's the average search time. So that's just again, a generalization of Holling's disk equation for multiple types of disk. So that's all we really are going to care about today is the fact that this rate exists. So we're going to keep referring to this long-term rate of gain as an opportunity cost. So again, it's while I'm eating, this is what I'm giving up by not searching. So I should probably make decisions that are keep in mind the gains I'm currently getting versus the gains I'm losing here for this opportunity cost. So that's what I'm kind of trying to say here. It's a measure, a price tag of how much benefit the rest of the environment that I'm not in right now could give me if I just went back into search. So it's the kind of exchange rate of calories for time in the market. So it's like I'm in one store in this patch or considering this prey item, and I'm saying, is this prey item worth it for me? This is, if all I care about is calories, I've got a certain number of calories that I have to pay a certain cost to get. And this opportunity cost is saying there are calories elsewhere in other stores, but you have to travel to get to them. So is a bird in hand, is the calories here, are those worth it for me? Or are they so high cost? Do I have to handle them so much that it's actually better for me to give up on them and go to another store where there's cheaper food? Cheaper in terms of handling time. Time is money when it comes to an animal. So we're going to model that as to say, I've just arrived at a prey item. I can recognize what type of prey item it is by its color, whatever. And I know that on average, that prey item gives me this benefit. So that's in calories. That's on average. If I eat that, I'm going to get 100 calories, 20 calories, whatever. That's what that is. And then I've got my handling time. So, but I don't get that unless I first spend this much time in seconds or minutes or whatever, but in units of time. In order for me to get any of those calories, I have to go through that process. And there's no in between. I can't like handle it for half a second or half of the handling time and get half of the calories. That would be a patch problem. So we're considering this other extreme where it's all or nothing. And so then how do we determine if the gain that I get from this prey item is worth the cost, the price that is labeled on it, on the grocery store shelves? So whenever you see time, you can think dollars. And it's again, it's like, does this have enough calories for the dollars that I'm putting into it? So with that in mind, does anybody have a thought of how you would solve this problem? If you were there with your calculator in the grocery store or out, in the desert, looking around for food or whatever, if, numerically, does anybody have a guess as to how you make this decision? Some thoughts as to that. Is that a hand? Well, what do you mean by the benefits over time? Right. So there's a comment was benefits over time. So suggests that maybe this ratio is important. But then what do you compare that ratio to? Any thoughts? So if I'm at the grocery store and I find a particular item and it's a can of tuna or something like that. And it's so many ounces, it's like 10 ounces or whatever, and it says, oh, it's $5. Um, I a lot of times on the label, they'll then tell me what dollar amount per ounce that is. And then I can go and say, well, is that a good price per ounce? And then I can go and say, well, you know what? At Safeway next door, I can buy 8 ounces of tuna for a different, or maybe just keep it simple. If I'm just they got tuna, 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 they're all different sizes. But if they've all been normalized to the per unit price, I can compare the per unit price and maybe I buy the generic. So that's kind of like taking the ratio here is like that per unit price. And so if you're standing there in the tuna aisle, you might then pick the one that has the lowest per unit price. So the lowest number, the lowest price per ounce. This is like the reciprocal of that if I did G over H. So with that in mind, with everything that's behind me here, what do you think is a good threshold that I should use for my decision for whether this has a good per unit price? What is my alternative? Again, I could eat or I can search. So how do I decide if it's better to search versus eat? I'm just looking for a number, a threshold. What should I compare in a model? What should I compare these terms to figure out if I should eat this prey or go back to search? Yeah, on the right. Oh, um, what do you mean by the energy it takes to do it? Remember, and so in this model, we're not modeling the metabolic cost. That's all wrapped up in this gain. This is the net gain. So it is true that in order for me to eat, I have to expend energy to get energy. But that's all taken. This we can consider that to be the net gain here. So the only thing that we know about this thing is how much energy it gives us and how much time it takes for us to get it. Did you have your hand was up too? Oh, that's okay. So it's not quite energy that I'm looking for, but I am looking to compare to something and I need to figure out what number to use for that comparison. How do I figure out that threshold? Remember, what is this? This opportunity cost. This is the market rate of calories to time. This is, I kind of hate that everything I'm going to be is going to be kind of gain to time. But, I feel like foraging theory would make a lot more sense to people if they would have framed it in terms of time to gain, because then it has much more economic. It's like how many dollars, it's like, but I don't know, but it's still just sort of the reciprocal or whatever. And so we're saying here, this opportunity cost is saying for if I want to figure out how much gain I'm losing out by spending this amount of time eating this thing. So forget about this gain, just focus on this. Let's say I decide to eat this item that I found, and it's going to take me 5 minutes to eat that item. What is the opportunity cost of eating that item? How do I figure out how many calories I'm losing by not going to search? Any thoughts? It's on the page. So I've got time here. So if I want to turn time into calories lost, I need to multiply time by a conversion rate between calories and time. What is the conversion rate that's behind me? Yeah. R, that's right. So R is the opportunity cost, the calories per second. This is how much, if you multiply any hypothetical time by R, it will tell you on average, if you spend H time in this patch, you're gonna lose out on H times R calories you could have gotten by going and searching instead. So if I want to compare, so one way I could compare this is I could say, well, I'm going to get G calories by eating this prey item, and I can compare that to H times R calories for searching. And so if I go back to search, I get 100 calories, but if I stay here and eat this, I get 50 calories. Well, in that case, I should go back to search. On the other hand, this is 500 calories, and then it's 500 versus whatever this is times R, if that's like 100 calories, then I get more calories for that same time here. Remember, time is money when it comes to animals. And so what money do they pay? They pay the time that they spend. So this G divided by H, that's what we're going to end up calling the profitability. It's sort of an unfortunate term, but that's just what we call it. That ends up being the exchange rate. That's sort of saying that for this many calories, this is how much you had to pay in terms of time. And there always are two options for a forager. You either pay the time here and get that gain, or you put that time instead into searching and get that gain. And you balance the two of them. So the way that looks is this ratio here. You look at a prey items in the model case, what rate maximization would predict is that the optimal diet will be such that you look at this profitability, gain per time. This is how much time it took for me to handle that, to go and open it up and eat it and stand there and process it. That's the time it took me. And then I end up getting a certain amount of calories out of it. So calories per time, that's a unit of, it's basically joules per time. It's watts. It's a power unit. So this is how much gain I get per unit time out from eating that item. And then this over here is how much gain per unit time I get from searching for other items and eating those other items. So I go back to search, I eventually find other items, and so on and so forth. This is an opportunity cost rate for units of time. So I could multiply both sides by H, and I'd be comparing calories to calories. But in this case, I'm comparing calories per time to calories per time. So in order to figure out whether you should eat something, you just have to ask, do I get a better rate, a better exchange rate of calories per time with my current prey item or with the long-term rate of return I'm getting from just searching in the environment? And if the current prey item has less calories for the same time, then it's the less than here, then I reject that prey item. If instead the profitability, as we'll call this, the calories per unit time is greater than the average calories per unit time I'm getting from my searching, then this is good and I should eat that because I'll end up doing better for that. So that's the comparison I make. I compare the so-called profitability of each encountered prey to some estimate of how many calories I've gotten over the whole foraging bout divided by how long the whole foraging bout is. So, I know that I've been foraging for an hour. I've gotten, 100 calories over those 3,600 seconds. That's my background rate. So my question is always when I run into a new prey item, will this give me more than that 100 calories for 3,600 seconds, that 100 calories per hour? Will that give me more than I'm getting from the background? If it gives me less than I'm getting from the background, then I will find something else that's better than this. I will just keep on. But if it's more than I'm getting from the background, then I should eat it and it might even improve the background. That's the idea behind these optimal prey choice models. Compare the profitability to the long-term rate of gain, profitability to opportunity cost. All right, so questions about that so far? Is it clear? We're trying to get a kind of an economic perspective where you pay time to get calories. Okay, so if all of that's true, then I can take all of the prey items in an environment and rank them by this term profitability. And I don't like the term profitability, but it's just a term they've been using since the 80s. But so profitability means a prey item's balance of gain to handling time. And so if I go through all of the possible prey items or all the possible types of prey items, I could sort them and with the highest profitability type, so the cheapest calories here. So these are, I get the most calories for the less time. These are the most expensive calories over here. So I get the fewest calories for the same time. Yep. Profitability. Profitability is the ratio of gain to handling time. So every prey type has a different profitability. So I sort them all, and the the background rate that I get from the environment is like a fence post that separates the prey that I eat from the prey that I ignore. And so that's where this opportunity cost fits. At the optimal diet predicted by rate maximization, then I would expect that if I gave a predator in the laboratory a bunch of options like this, then it would eat. If I then looked at what it ate, it would eat a set of them that have high profitability and would ignore a set of them that have low profitability, and there wouldn't be mixing. That would be the dividing line. There would be a critical profitability above which they eat it and below which they don't. That's what this model would predict if I set that experiment up in the laboratory. So questions about this? This is the sort of depiction. And this, if you think about it, is like a lumped version of the marginal value theorem. This is sort of, whereas the marginal value theorem, it's like, how long am I staying in a patch? Well, I stay up to the point where the instantaneous returns hit the opportunity cost, and then I leave because it's better for me to search at that point. This is a similar idea, but it's not how long am I staying in a patch, it's which prey items do I take? And I'm saying that I take every prey item that has a better return than the long-term environment. Once I get to prey items that have a similar return, the next one down, I'll ignore it. I'll stop there. I don't eat those prey because it's better for me to search than to eat those prey. So, yeah. So, yeah, questions about that before we go on and talk about the predictions here. Let's see how it tests. Okay, so some predictions. So one of the predictions we get out of this is, so you could imagine that you could change the encounter rate for items that are in the diet. So the suggestion here is if you make items in the diet more profitable, or sorry, not more, sorry, if you make them more frequent, so you space them together more closely instead of as farther apart, then, well, just in general, if you change that, so if you change the spacing between items in the diet, then that is going to change how much energy is coming into the forager. So that will change its long-term rate of gain over the whole search area, which may mean that it stops eating some of these lower profitability prey. So if you make these high profitability prey more frequent, that might kick out some of these lower profitability prey. So that's one of the things that we get here. Alternatively, if you change that it's by that happens like either by changing the search time or it just happens by enriching making the animal fatter or making the animal have to use less time. So there are different mechanisms that could cause this long-term rate of gain to move. But if you make this richer, if you enrich these items in the diet, this fence post will move to the left and it will start excluding more items. That's one of the predictions. Another prediction we have is kind of the flip side of that. Items that the prey or the predator is ignoring, if you change their encounter rates, the predator will continue to ignore them. So you can imagine other diet choice models where this might not be the case, where you sort of keep track of all of these things. And once something that is maybe less profitable becomes really plentiful, then you think, well, for I don't know what reasons, you could come up with some other currency, then maybe you'd start eating those. But if you are maximizing rate, so if you're trying to sort of balance this opportunity cost, then things that the predator is not eating, if you make them more frequent or less frequent, as long as you don't change the frequency of things the predator is eating, it won't change the predator's diet. That's another prediction that we would get. Okay, so those are predictions, and we're going to see if those work out. And then possible mechanisms. So I put a little plug for a paper I wrote about this once upon a time. But you say, well, how? This is just to put this is a in terms of a functional hypothesis. This answers the question of why do we see the quail eating some things and not others? It's not saying how. Now you can say, well, then how does, if we do witness a quail changing its diet according to these predictions, how the heck is it figuring out that it should be including some prey and not including the others? Well, one simple mechanism that you might suggest is to use an estimate of how full the gut is. And that gives you an estimate of how much you've eaten during your foraging round. And so if you had, that's effectively your accumulated gain. And then in your head, you know how much time you've spent out there. So if you use how full you are versus how long you've been eating, that has the ability, at least physiologically, you could imagine a neurophysiological mechanism that would allow you to discriminate among prey to exclude and prey to include. So that's sort of one possibility for how you could build a mechanism to this. A bonus for this said mechanism is if you happen to be a hungry predator, you will eat everything until you get your gut kind of gets rid of that hunger transient, and then you'll become more selective. So a nice bonus of this mechanism that isn't modeled in for rate maximization is it has like risk sensitivity built into it. Hungry predators will do different things than satiated predators. So hungry predators effectively sacrifice gain maximization to bed hedge. They eat everything because they don't know what's coming. And that sort of helps them buy down uncertainty. They give up their gain because they're not eating the optimal diet, but they get less uncertainty. So it's this natural bed hedging that occurs. And then animals with high energy stores are more selective. So then they switch to maximizing their rate of gain. So this mechanism just happens to potentially also have other functional benefits in terms of risk sensitivity. So let's see how either of those play out. So this was an experiment that was done by Halling, same Halling disk model guy, but it wasn't interpreted with a theoretical model until 10 years later by Charnov, a faculty used to be actually University of Arizona and now retired. So Halling got these data, they're really compelling data. Then Charnov built the models that I just presented to you. So both the prey model and the marginal value theorem. So Tuesday and Thursday, those are all due to basically Eric Charnov with input from people like David Stevens and things like that. But these data came even earlier than that from Halling, the same Halling disk equation guy. And so Halling gave a mantid a bunch of flies, horse flies, I think, that and so his first question was, does a mantid have the ability to detect how full its stomach is? And so the thought was that your stomach clears at a particular rate, and maybe that provides a mechanism to figure out how full it is. So what they did is they basically gave a whole pile of flies to a mantid after certain starvation periods. And so you starve the mantid and then you give them the pile of flies. And then you starve them longer, you give them a pile of flies, and those so forth. And so you've got how long you've deprived them on the x-axis, and then you've got how much the mantid eats before it stops eating on the y-axis. And what you see there is if the mantid hasn't been starved very long, it doesn't eat very much. If it has been starved quite a long time, it eats, but it rounds out. It tops out at a level here. I may not seem that exciting, but I mean, it's an important result that shows that this mantid has physiological feedbacks where it knows or is aware of how full its gut is. And I think they also did dissections and things like that to help verify these things. But just that's the behavioral data that theoretically the mantid has physiological feedback that could be used by its behaviors to adjust how it selects prey items based on how hungry it is. So we can see that a hungry mantid eats differently than a full mantid. All right, so that's the first thing. So mechanism potentially is there. Questions about these data? Okay, so then, and this is really the cool result. So you let the mantid, you have horse flies, and you can manipulate their profitability. Hulling didn't think of it as profitability. He was focused on other sorts of trade-offs and was trying to basically understand how these trade-offs affect. He didn't have the sort of synoptic model that Charnov had, but still he ended up producing horseflies with different handling times. How did he do that? He basically put them at different distances from the mantid. So mantids are kind of these sit and wait predators. So you basically can sit a horsefly in front of it, and the mantid can then choose to do its thing, right? It's like its mantid thing. So the farther you put the horsefly away from the mantid, you can then evaluate, is the mantid going to jump? And is it going to go all the way out, pay that time cost, and eat the fly or not? So the same horseflies at different distances represent different prey types with different profitabilities. So same calories, but you pay different costs. And that is what, and I've it's sort of ugly what they call it there, but effectively this is profitability. So this here represents a horsefly that is very close to the mantid. This down here represents a horsefly that's at an intermediate distance from the mantid. And this right here is a horsefly that is very far away from the mantid. So you can give this horsefly all of these choices over and over again. And then you can, or sorry, not the horse, give the mantid these dead horseflies over and over again. And then you can see how much food has the mantid ingested. So you can plot food in gut here, and then you know how long it's taken the mantid to ingest that food. So you can calculate the rate that from this whole experiment, how much food is getting into the mantid. And you can say, oh, it's so many grams per minute. So I'm just noticing as it goes through here, this experiment, the way we've set it up, they're based on all the mantid's choices, we can calculate the long-term rate of gain that mantid has gotten. And so that ends up setting up, that is the slope of this line right here. So this here is an estimate of that long-term rate of gain. And look at the crazy thing that happens. Once we know the long-term rate of gain of the mantid, and we know the profitability, so each one of these is how many sort of calories per second that each one of these horseflies is, where the per second is controlled by the distance away from the mantid, then it separates things up. Like the mantid doesn't eat pretty much any of these that are below this rate of gain, and it eats all of these that are above this rate of gain. And on top of that, it actually eats them according to their profitability. So it actually sort of prefers the high profitability ones more than the others. But it doesn't eat any of the low profitability ones. So this is exactly what was predicted by Charnov's model. And it's been reproduced in all sorts of different ways. It ends up being a very useful tool for thinking about diet selection, at least in cases where the animal isn't constrained by other needs, which we'll talk about here in a second. But it's one of the first validations of this optimal prey choice model from Charnov. So, questions about this experiment? Okay, I think it's just beautiful data. I mean, rarely do you get this like slice where it's works out perfectly. Yep. No, no, they're not. Yeah, this line is don't. So there's a lot of others because this is Holling's graph when he wasn't even trying. Chernov's model didn't even exist when Holling did this experiment. So Holling was trying uh, to sort of Holling was, I think, when Holling looked at these data, he was trying to sort of understand where this line comes from. And I think we can. That's an interesting question, but that's not the question that the prey choice model was necessarily directly answering. So you can ignore this dotted line. The line that you're supposed to pay attention to is this solid line, which is that long-term rate of gain. And so this is suggesting that if you made it harder for the mantid to eat, then this line would rotate down like a big swinging door. And as it rotated down, then suddenly it would start eating more of these. Likewise, if you made like these horse flies more frequent, that would enrich this line and it would swing up and it would start cutting off more of these so that it would only eat these and then these would go down to this axis here. So the point about the ones under this line is they're pretty much at zero. They pretty much don't eat. Um, the mantid doesn't eat any of those, but it does eat the ones that are greater than that profitability. Okay. All right, questions. So optimal prey choice in the kind of simplest sense, no constraints, no other things the animal needs to worry about. All right, big thing I want you to take away from that is order by profitability. Long-term rate of gain becomes a fence post separating the good from the bad. That's the big thing. That's really a whole lecture moving forward towards the final exam. That's the big thing for this particular lecture that I want you to take up. But we just want to kind of keep it real. So I want to add in a few other more complications at this point. But I think I've got okay, no. So constraints mess everything up. So we already had this cool example. At least I think it's cool from lecture F1 of the sloth, where it has this nitrogen constraint. So folivores, things that eat leaves, typically are very slow. They're not top predators. They don't often have big brains because you need a lot of protein to grow a big brain, and they're just not getting it. But they do need some protein. They need nitrogen, so they have to get it from other means. And that's if you remember the story here, is that the reason it takes the time to climb down the tree to poop has to do with a complex symbiosis with several different organisms that end up producing green algae on its back, up to 3% its body mass. And that algae provides it the nitrogen that it needs for proteins and amino acids and so on and so forth. So, that's all driven by a nutrient constraint. That's one of the things there. We've also talked about, last time limits. So if you're a bird that it's winter, it's cold, you can't move around at night. It's so cold. You just need enough energy to go into sleep and survive the night. Then it is really important that before it gets too cold at the end of the day, that you have enough energy to survive the night. And that time limit, that's another constraint, drives you to do things that may not be rate maximization. So at the beginning of the day, you might rate maximize, but towards the end of the day, you might approach a stretch goal and you might be actually seeking out. So you might be risk averse at the beginning of the day, risk prone at the end of the day. So constraints make animals do weird things. And I only mean it's weird in that the currencies we usually use to make sense of their behavior don't make sense anymore because they're effectively the wrong currency. Selective pressure is all about choosing the right limitation. There are so many selective pressures on an animal out in the wild. And the best we can do is pick a model organism where one of those selective pressures dominates so much that we can study it in isolation. But in most animals, they're being selected for all sorts of things simultaneously, and it's really hard to disentangle one from the other. And the so far, the optimal foraging models we've been talking about have been just focusing on opportunity costs. How do I get the most amount of energy so that I still have time left over to, to mate, to fight, to flee, and so on. But there can be other things that are driving foraging behavior. And one of them is like gut capacity. So, this cicada is a relatively large insect. And, pop several of those into this bird, and eventually it's going to be pushed up against a gut constraint. So, optimal prey choice might say you should just keep eating those cicadas. But a gut constraint might suggest that, after three, you should maybe eat something else and you should ignore cicadas after that. So that's what I mean. It adds constraints. Other things, toxins from food. There are a bunch of animals that need to eat food that's toxic to them, like folivores, leaf eaters. So you may have to eat leaves for some things, but those leaves have so many toxins. That's why, I mean, what is a big, does anybody know what is a major physiological difference in leaf eaters and folivores? Yeah. Well, they might eat the point. Yeah, they might. That's a behavioral. But what are physiological adaptations? Like folivores are weird. Yeah, their teeth are different. That's one thing. Yeah. Go ahead. Their gut microbiome's different. Anything else? Yep. And their gut is different. They might have multiple stomachs. They might have their duodenum or whatever is might be larger. They have there are pieces of our gut that are that hardly are doing anything. That if you were to open up a koala or a sloth, would be gigantic because they just have to process these things totally differently. So and a lot of that is getting rid of the toxins, processing the cellulose, trying to get stuff out of it, and then just having enough room for all of that bulk in there. It's just, so yeah, there are animals that have to eat things that for us we just couldn't eat, but that's a niche, it was possible for them to eat that, and they're eating that, so we don't have to compete with them. So that was a nice niche separation, right? Macronutrients, protein and carbohydrates. Protein is another one of these funny ones that if you don't have enough protein, there's this hypothesized protein leverage effect. So there's a thing called the geometric framework. It's a little bit out of the scope of this chapter, so I didn't put it in. But it's this idea that if you have a protein constraint and all of your food is carb heavy, then you will overeat carbs in order to hit your protein constraint. And that may help explain why there's not only obesity in humans. It turns out that if you look across zoo animals and even wild animals, there's an increase in non-human obesity as well, and people are trying to make sense of it. And some people think one possibility is with the increase in carbon in the atmosphere, you're actually getting a decrease in the carb to protein ratio in leaves, and you're actually making food that other animals are eating sweeter, and they're having to eat more of it to hit their protein limitation because they're protein limited, and they're just packing on calories in order to do that. So there could be a connection between global warming and or climate change and the nutritional content of trees and non-human obesity in the wild. That's one of the things that have been proposed out there, all due to this protein leverage effect. Carbs are another important one. A lot of times, there are animals that are carb limited, and then micronutrients. I mentioned quail around here. Turns out micronutrients are driving a lot of their foraging behavior. So there's a bunch of things that if you just consider energy, like these optimal foraging models do, you miss out on a lot. And one of the first studies that kind of showed this was this study by Gary Belovsky in the late 70s on these IORL moose. So these are sort of a famous population of moose that have been studied for all sorts of interesting ecological things. And so he built a far more complex and inclusive optimal foraging model that was not only based on energy, it allowed you to optimize for other things. You could throw in, rumen constraints. He's got this little rumen full. You could have, you could talk about like, well, for aquatics, things underwater, then it has sort of how much bulk, how much energy, how digestible it is, but also what's the sodium content of these. Likewise for leaves, and so on and so forth. And so he basically had this, he just threw in everything, in this and sort of asked if we include all of these things that are left out of optimal foraging models, then what different predictions do we get? It's sort of like a sensitivity analysis of like, do these things matter? And it turns out they did. So what he found is like if he chose an energy maximization model similar to what we're doing, but one that had a sodium constraint, that so then he knew that these moose, the terrestrial things they're eating, had very low sodium. The aquatic things that they were eating had very few calories, but very high sodium. And so he thought maybe that would be the only way that this moose could get sodium. And he did a computational model based on this stuff. And the diet that popped out said that you should eat about 18% of your diet as aquatics, in order to get the sodium. And then this went down through the other things that they could eat. And you'll get roughly this energy, and this is how much time you'll spend feeding. He also did it with a time minimization model. And then he went out and watched moose, and it turned out that the predictions for real moose that are out there were pretty much dead on what his model predicted, only if you included that sodium constraint. So sodium is really driving these moose. If you only considered energy, you might get a qualitative fit to some of the patterns that you see, but you wouldn't be able to explain why the moose are spending so much time eating these aquatics, because that's not being driven by energy, it's driven by sodium. So I think that's kind of cool, this Belovsky model. And then, so yeah, highlighting that aquatics there. Yeah, I'm sorry. By sodium, by salt. That's right. So these moose really need salt. They're limited by it in their environment. So that limitation drives them to do weird things in terms of the normal way we think about foraging. We think about foraging for energy, but energy isn't everything. You also need these micronutrients, and the micronutrients apparently are a significant driver of moose behavior. 20% of their diet is pretty cool. All right, so with that discussion in mind, let's think about red knots, or really any molluscivores. So any shorebird that eats mollusks. So I got a few mollusks down here, just to give kind of a reminder of some of the key features of mollusks. If you were thinking about a shorebird like this red knot that eats mollusks, is specialized on mollusks, what do you think a key aspect that might be left out of a typical foraging model might be that you really need to consider? Any thoughts? I mean, if we just look at the prey items next to me. Yeah? Count that as an inch. That's kind of where I'm going. So you could say that these could be a source of calcium. So you could ask, why do they eat the mollusks? You could say, well, maybe they're calcium limited and they're actually eating them for their shells. As an interesting related thing to that, there was a guy here who used to be a faculty member at ASU, John Sabo, who studied a lot of things water and how water limitation would drive behavior. And he found that there were a bunch of spiders that in the desert eat things that they don't eat anywhere else, and they're purely eating them because they're drinking them. So that they're eating these other prey items that they normally wouldn't eat, not because of their calories or their nutrients or whatever, but because they were nice little packets of water and they were basically just sucking them up like little Capri Suns. So that's an example of like water limitation driving behavior. So if they're calcium limited and you see them eating mollusks, you would say maybe actually they're eating them for their shells, the source of calcium. But what's something else we might think that is along those terms? Like let's say that they I think that would be an excellent hypothesis to test, but let's say we don't think they're calcium limited. We think that this is a niche that they've specialized on to get their energy out of. Well, then what's something else we need to consider about foraging for energy on mollusks related to that? What complication do you have? Yeah, yeah. I think that's kind of where I'm going with it. Like if if you eat seafood, if you eat scallops, you probably don't eat them in this form. The red knot does, right? So if you tried to eat a scallop in this form, that could be very bad for you, right? So birds like these shorebirds have special organs called gizzards, which are responsible for dealing with all of this junk, this bulk. They grind it up and they get rid of it. And that allows these birds to eat this, but it adds an additional physiological process. It adds a limitation. Those gizzards can only move so quickly. And that sets up a bulk constraint. It's like a gut constraint. It's a little bit like I can only eat so much. So even though I encountered a prey type that the optimal prey choice says that I should eat, I'm just not hungry right now. But that's a little bit, or not something that hungry, but I just don't have any room for it right now. I might be hungry, but I just don't have any room in my stomach. That's one kind of gut, and this is related to that, but it's a separate process where even though they might have stomach for it, their gizzard just isn't ready to process more shells. So that suggests that maybe prey choice is different in molluscivores than it would be in other birds. And so there have been models over time that model the sort of balance between energy intake rate. Notice they put it in units of watts. What does a watt come from? That's the profitability, joules per second, calories per second. So that's why sometimes you do see them. It seems like weird to refer to watts of power when talking about foraging, but that's really what's going on there. What's going on there? So on the y-axis here, each one of these dots is a different type of mollusk. And on the y-axis, we have their profitabilities, their energy per handling time. On the x-axis, plotted up here, we have their sort of ballast probability. It's sort of their energy per bulk. So how many calories you get, not per time, but per mass of shell. How much extra bulk do you have to take in order to get that energy? Now, I'm not going to go through the derivations. There have been some nice models there from the 90s that have been sort of worked onto there, but this is sort of one of the popular ones. And I'll just sort of explain how it works graphically. You can, for as these birds grow, the physiologists that study these birds know about how their gizzards work, and they know that for as the birds grow, then they increase their rate of basically being able to deal with this bulk. So there is a bulk constraint in terms of like grams per second or something like that. There is a constraint that has to do with how quickly can you expel stuff from that gizzard, and there is a way that you can map that to this ballast intake rate, this axis here, grams per second. You can say for this bird, this is the maximum amount of shells the bird can take on. That's it. It just if it take on more than that, then its gizzard is just not going to work. Um, and so there's this line that is formed. Again, I don't want to go into the details here, but this curve can basically be formed again by the aspects of its diet. And what you do is you find where the first mollusk that crosses this intake rate, and then you create a line that is tangent at that point, and then everything to this side of that line you eat, and everything to this side of the line you ignore. So again, I'm not going into the details. You don't need to know the details. I'm not going to ask you to do that, but I'm just showing you that there is a specialist in this area. After you got practice at doing this, could do this over and over again with no problems. You can learn how to do this and be easy. There, it is relatively simple. It's a graphical version. Like before, I see your question, but it's for we were ranking profitabilities and picking a fence post. This is like a 2D version of that. So you have to kind of learn how to draw it, but then it's not really that much different than ranking profitabilities and choosing the right fence post. So here there's kind of multiple fence posts here. You have to kind of set one fence post and then another fence post, but then you end up deciding there's certain mollusks you eat and certain mollusks you don't eat. Question. The you don't so this kind of black region has to do with the things that the gizzard can process. So it's again, I don't want to go into too many details. I just want you to say that there is a way that is different. It is a strict. So if you were rate maximizing, you would draw a horizontal line over here. Like the optimal forager in the Charnov sense, there would be a horizontal line that going to this point, and you would eat all of these up here, all of them. But the one that is constrained by the gizzard rate would eat these over here. And the cool thing that comes out of these models, so this is, if I want you to remember anything, this is the thing I want you to remember about these ballast intake rate constraint models, is that in our old models, the prey choice model from Charnov, it had the so-called 0-1 rule, which means that you either eat or ignore. There's no in between. You don't ever flip a coin. You don't ever say, okay, well, sometimes I eat this, sometimes I don't. It's either the optimal thing is you either put it in the eat category or the not. When you involve this ballast stuff, though, there ends up being at least one type of prey that has a partial preference. So that means that like it'll be like 40% of the time. So when when suddenly they encounter this mollusk, they effectively flip a coin in their head. And you say, what is the point of that? Well, it turns out that sometimes they need to give their gizzards a break. And we can model that, or the way that comes out of the data is it looks like the birds are flipping a coin, and it's effectively allowing their gizzards time to free up a little bit so that their gizzards then can start processing more bulk. And it comes out of the data. You can actually see that these birds do have a mollusks they eat, mollusks they don't eat, and mollusks they flip coins for, just like these models show. So, big thing there. I just want to show you constraints change things. But if you're not constrained, energy drives everything for sure in animals. And that optimal prey choice model is a good thing to know. All right, so there's a reminders. We'll close with this guy, something to think about as you go to dinner. So the question here is, how might you explain with an optimality model basically why salad comes first and it comes without any other food? So I give you two options. Do you think maybe it's low profitability relative to the food or high profitability? So is salad a highly profitable or low profitable food? And then I'll just let you chew on how that might affect whether, why it comes first and what would happen if it didn't. Oh, there's Dexter. Hi, buddy. Hey, buddy. Happy Diwali. Yeah, that's right. It's low profitability. So if you serve them at the same time of the other food, you just eat anything else. Yeah. Right. Yes. Hi, buddy. Hi, buddy. Yes.